Did you just recently get your first reptile, or are you thinking about getting your first reptile? Well, today we're going to talk about the 5 most common mistakes new reptile keepers make. Mistake number 5, which we're gonna go 5 to 1, and 1 is going to be the most important mistake that new reptile keepers make. So mistake number 5 is that new keepers will often put a baby reptile in an adult enclosure. It might seem nice to think that you won't have to spend money on multiple enclosures as the reptile gets larger and grows out of previous ones. However, this can cause some issues, but there are ways to work around it too. Putting a baby reptile in an adult enclosure is more of an issue with some species more than others. For example, it's really an issue with bearded dragons and leopard geckos because they can't find or catch their food as well. If you think about it, a baby lizard in a giant enclosure allows prey items to run or hop away or hide, and that just makes it difficult for babies to really become established and find their food. But you can avoid this altogether by feeding baby lizards in a separate container. Then you can still house them in a big enclosure, and you can ensure that they're finding their food. As far as snakes go, hognose snakes seem to be impacted most when they are put into a too big of an enclosure when they are a baby. Like this one here is just about 6 months old, and this is probably a hognose that should be in a maybe 5-gallon tank at most. If a baby hog, and I see this happen all the time, I mean, we breed hognoses. If a baby hognose snake is put in a 40-gallon or even a 10-gallon enclosure, they feel way too exposed. There's too much space. They get stressed out because they're kind of a high-strung species, or they definitely can be.
Yeah, especially this one.
Especially this one, and that causes them not to eat. Interestingly enough, we have found over the years of selling or breeding and selling baby hognoses that if a hognose is put into too large of an enclosure or too open of an enclosure, they will still eat their first and sometimes their second meal, but then they stop completely. So if you have a new hognose and it ate its first, you might think that, oh, it likes its habitat, this is perfect, and then it stops. That means your habitat is too big. I don't know why that connection is made and why they still eat their first 1 or 2 meals when it is too big of a habitat, but that's just something that we've picked up over the years. So you can avoid hognoses going off of food by putting them either in a small baby enclosure and upgrading as they grow, or by filling up a large enclosure with a lot of clutter and enrichment so that they feel tighter and therefore more secure. However, we've found that more often than not with both lizards and snakes, it tends to be better if this is your first reptile to put them in a smaller enclosure first and then an adult enclosure when they're ready. By the way, since this is about new reptile keepers and likely new reptile keepers start with baby reptiles, we're going to be featuring a lot of young reptiles in today's video, including this red line double het coral, or het for albino and lavender hognose snake. She's very sassy. This is her first video. We need a name idea for her. She's going to be a future breeder of ours, but isn't she pretty already? Mistake number 4 is handling your new reptile too soon or too frequently. I know it's so tempting when you get your first reptile, you want to hold it right away, you want to start interacting with it, cuddling it.
All the time.
Yes, all the time. But if you handle them too soon or too much, you can stress out your friends to the point where they don't want to eat. We recommend letting your new snake or other reptiles settle in for at least 5 to 7 days so that it can find its favorite hides, it can find its basking area, find its water dish, and establish some scent trails. After that, if it's a snake, you can try feeding it. If it's a lizard, you'll probably want to feed it before a week of having it. But assuming your reptile is eating regularly and it seems comfortable, then you can start handling it at that point. And when you start handling your reptile, it's best not to go from no handling at all to handling for hours a day. Kind of ease them into handling. Start with just a few minutes initially and kind of go from there to the point where you can handle them for upwards of, say, an hour, but it's a building process. I mean, try to put yourself in their shoes or their shed skin, I guess. Say an alien abducted you and put you in a new enclosure on an alien spaceship, and after 5 days it took you out and then it put you back in and it took you out for hours and put you back in. You'd be really stressed, right? I know I definitely would be.
Yeah. And then try doing it on day 1.
Oh,
like
yeah.
They just keep taking it out and putting it in for a week. You're not going to eat.
That'd be even worse. Yeah, exactly. So try to put yourself in your reptile's shoes and just give them time to adjust.
Yeah, you gotta build that trust with them.
Yeah, and when you are ready to handle them for longer or extended periods of time, you still don't want to overdo it. You want to make sure your reptile has enough enclosure time to be able to warm up its body and thermoregulate, because reptiles, being ectothermic or cold-blooded, need an external heat source in order to digest their food. So if you take a reptile out of their enclosure for too long, they won't be able to digest their food because they can't get warm enough, and then their meals will start spoiling inside of them. Since we're on the subject already, if you just fed your snake, it's definitely a good idea to leave them alone for 24 to 48 hours in the first place to let them start digesting that meal. Talking about handling actually reminds me of a story and something that was unfortunate that I saw, but she didn't mean any harm. We saw, or I saw anyway, a girl who was 12 to 14 years old maybe at one of the shows, one of the big reptile expos, but it was in the middle of the winter, and she had in like a insulated lunchbox a baby redfoot tortoise just like slung on her shoulder that she had just gotten like a few days prior. So she was stressing out this redfoot. I know she loved it so much, but this poor redfoot was so stressed. It was just in this little lunchbox, not sure what was going on with its life in the winter, in the cold, and back and forth. Just leave your new friends alone for at least a week, maybe even longer if they need it.
They would prefer to be in their enclosure anyway.
Yeah, they would, yes. And yeah, taking it to an expo, that means it was out of its enclosure for probably 6 to 10 hours that day and didn't have a heat source to digest food. So again, take it slow and step by step when it comes to handling your new pet reptile. Speaking of new pet reptiles, this is an albino. Oh, hello.
Well,
I thought you were just striking. Okay, well, yeah, this is an albino house snake who apparently has a really strong feeding response.
It's a hungry albino house snake.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to handling, if you notice that your snake is getting too stressed out and they start striking, then it might be best to put them back for a little bit of a break. But you definitely don't want to encourage them to bite in order to go back in their enclosures. So if you notice it becoming a habit, keep holding on to them until they let go. Don't let them learn that biting means going back into their enclosure.
I feel like that's more of a food response.
That was definitely a food response. Yeah, you're not angry, you're just hungry.
We also don't have a name for this girl either, so we need a name for her and her boyfriend.
Mistake number 3 is not using a thermostat. And this one has a special place in our hearts because this was the biggest mistake that Ed and I made with our first snake, or Ed's first snake, Athena. Yeah, Athena was an albino ball python. It was, I guess, either of our first snake. Sure. You got a snake before I ever did. And we put her in a 40-gallon enclosure, and excuse the photos, guys, we did not know as much as we do nowadays. I don't know what that red substrate was about, but she had red dyed substrate.
Yeah, red aspen or something
I guess. It was weird because we use tropical stuff now.
Because she also had a humidity box.
She did have a humidity box, that is true, but we had a heat mat on the underside of the tank and we just plugged it directly into the wall. Yeah. The problem with heat mats is they don't have any built-in thermostats or regulators, so they just accept all the power from the outlet and, well, that the device can take. It's full power to the heat mat, and we have actually temp gunned heat mats at like 125 degrees when they're plugged directly into the wall. And this is likely what happened to our Ed's ball python Athena. She got a major burn on her belly because that heat mat was way too hot, and she, as a result of a secondary infection because of it, passed away. So
and it wasn't like it happened in a year or 6 months. She lived like that in those conditions for 5 years before something happened.
Right. I guess the saying goes, it's okay until it isn't.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we talked to a handful of people and they think she got a cold and she was trying to warm herself up, and that's when she got burned.
Yeah. So we unfortunately learned this lesson the hard way, but hopefully you won't by watching this video and using a thermostat with your heat source, especially heat mats, which are, again, unregulated. Basically how these thermostats work is instead of plugging your heat mat into the wall, you plug it into the back of the thermostat. And there's many different brands of these. We use Herpstats. We find they work really well, but there's plenty of brands out there. Once you have your heat mat plugged in, you put your heat mat into position and you place the probe of the thermostat on top of the heat mat where the reptile will be sitting. You can also sandwich it in between the heat mat and the bottom side of the glass or the enclosure itself. Then you set or program the desired temperature on the thermostat, and it will make sure that the probe stays within a couple degrees of your desired temperature. So it'll control how much power goes to the mat, and it'll prevent it from overheating and potentially burning and killing your snake. And thermostats aren't meant only for heat mats. You can use them for other heat sources too, like heat panels and ceramic heat emitters. You can even use these for basking bulbs. Now this brand of thermostat, the Herpstat, has a dimming capability, so it just controls how much power at once goes to the device that you're trying to heat. Some thermostats are an on-off thermostat, which means they turn the power on and they turn it off and on and off, which means if you use an on-off thermostat on a basking bulb, it's going to turn your light bulb on and off and on and off, whereas this one will dim it instead to keep it within that desired temperature range. But if you have the on-off on a basking bulb, it's probably going to burn out your bulb a little bit easier. Honestly, with bulbs, I don't use thermostats, just find the right wattage of bulb to create the ideal basking spot for your reptile. But using pretty much any other heat source, so again, ceramic heat emitters, heat panels, and especially heat mats, definitely use a thermostat.
Heat tape as well.
Heat tape, ooh, that's a good one, yeah. By the way, this is our baby banana pastel special ball python that we hatched out earlier this year. It's crazy how we've gone from you having your very first ball python to us producing this one and keeping it this year. He is so pretty, and we still need a name for him.
I like his white spots on his neck.
He's so pretty. He's a good eater. I love his pattern. We're definitely keeping him to use in programs and breeding maybe in the future. He's a wonderful eater. I love this guy so much. Again, this is our banana pastel special.
Yeah, which we need a name, which the theme of this video is Name Our Snakes.
Apparently. Number 2, or the second most common mistake made by new reptile keepers, is buying wild-caught animals instead of captive-bred ones. In case you didn't already know, wild-caught animals are generally a lot cheaper than captive-bred, and that's because the person selling them, usually at reptile shows, simply had to import them from the wild, and they just bring them to a show and flip them for a profit. They don't have to breed the animal, which entails taking care of the parents, incubating eggs, raising up babies to make sure that they thrive, and breeders who make all those efforts have to charge a little bit more to cover their costs and their time. And sometimes the difference in price can be double. I've seen that in quite a few species. It's twice as expensive to get a captive bred one versus a wild caught animal, which does make it enticing to buy a wild caught specimen, but wild caught reptiles generally come with a wide variety of issues. I mean, there is a phrase that you get what you pay for, and that's really the case with reptiles too. If it's a cheap reptile, there's probably a reason for it. Wild caught animals generally come in, not all the time, but a lot of them have nicks or imperfections in their scales or along their body. For example, this Madagascar giant hognose, which is a long-term captive, which means it's been in captivity for a while, but it was originally wild caught. It has a blemish right here. I don't know what that's from. We have some wild caught reptiles in our zoo that were rescues that we took in, but they originally were in the wild and they have imperfections and old injuries as well. Oftentimes, wild caught reptiles will come in with parasites, and depending on how long they've been in captivity or with the seller, or if the seller is a responsible one or not, they may or may not have been treated for those parasites. Go away, man. Oh, he's bothering me. Oh, I hit him. Okay, got him. And if you're a new reptile keeper, you don't want to have to deal with parasites and treating for health issues because it's a wild-caught animal.
That means going to a vet, getting an appointment, getting the meds, then having weeks of giving them the meds.
Yes, it's too stressful. It ends up being sometimes more expensive than just buying a captive bred animal in the first place.
And sometimes with all that, they don't make it through the treatments.
Yeah, or they just don't thrive in captivity. They don't learn how to adapt to an environment that's not in the wild anymore, so they refuse to eat and they just crash and they pass away. So there are tons of issues that wild-caught reptiles can come with, so it's honestly not worth the cheaper price to get a wild-caught animal when there are captive-bred alternatives. Captive-bred reptiles, on the other hand, generally don't come with parasites. They haven't been attacked by predators, they're used to captive life, they're generally more handleable, and overall they just make better pets. They are worth the extra cost, trust me on it. This is one of our baby Madagascar giant hognoses. We produced this one, and she is so handleable. The one I had out just before musked all over my hands when I took her out of her enclosure because she's wild caught and not used to people. But this girl has been with humans her whole life, so it doesn't bother her coming out like this. She also needs a name, by the way. We need a name for this girl.
We're following theme.
Yep. All that being said, we do not want to demonize wild-caught animals altogether. I mean, in order to get captive-bred specimens, where are they going to come from? Wild caught animals originally, right? We have some wild caught animals in our own collection because we weren't able to find captive bred alternatives, so we wanted to create some so that we could lessen the impact of wild catching animals.
This is a perfect example.
Yes.
This baby came from a trio of wild caught specimens who were in America already, and we bought them and now have produced a bunch of babies with them.
Exactly. So you can justify wild caught animals if you are either going to use them in education to help preserve them in the wild or help conserve them, or if you are going to be breeding them to, again, help protect the wild ones. So if they have a good job to do and a responsible job, that's when we can justify wild caught. But again, if this is going to be your first reptile, you're probably not going to have the experience to breed them anyway, so don't get a wild-caught animal. Save yourself the money and the headache by getting a captive-bred alternative.
There are a lot of great breeders out there who breed amazing animals for beginner keepers.
This is actually why we stopped mentioning and featuring egg-eating snakes on our channel. We used to keep them, we used to breed them occasionally, but they were a really cool snake. However, we accidentally encouraged the obtaining of wild-caught egg-eating snakes since captive-bred ones just aren't available. And that was the opposite of the impact we were trying to make. So we stopped featuring egg-eating snakes because it just wasn't doing anything good for the hobby. It was just causing more of a demand for wild-caught animals. Maybe someday there'll be enough captive-bred ones that they can be a mainstream pet. And the most common mistake that is made by new reptile keepers is buying reptiles without doing research. People, avoid impulse purchases. There are temptations at reptile shows left and right, but avoid the temptation because it's not going to benefit you or the animal if you don't do the correct research. Ed and I have both seen on multiple occasions kids at reptile expos
And adults.
And adults buying, say, a snake. I've seen both snakes and lizards.
Yep.
They buy one and then they go to their local herpetological society's booth at the show and ask, what is this that I just bought? They don't know what they bought, so they don't know how to take care of it, and they bought it, and it's, oh my gosh, it makes my heart break every time. We've also seen plenty of families go home with baby sulcata tortoises, which are so cute, don't get me wrong, but those things are gonna grow to over 100 pounds someday.
Yeah, there's been a handful of times I've been like, that's so cool, what are you gonna do with it when it gets really big? And they're like, how big's it gonna get? And I'm like, oh no!
Yeah, so if you don't do research, the animal is the one that ends up suffering in the end. This is actually a great example. This is one of our baby mangrove snakes that we hatched earlier this year, and this is a beautiful, beautiful snake. And I think because of it, it would probably get snatched up right away at a reptile show. However, this species, the mangrove snake, has specific care requirements, and it's actually mildly venomous. So a lot of research has to be done in order to properly have one of these and care for it and raise it up, and a lot of people would probably just buy it off a table because it looks really cool.
This is also a good one for the fourth one, which is wild caught, because a lot of times these are wild imports, and then you're getting a giant one that's mean, striky, mildly venomous.
Yes.
And, you know, some wild caught vendors aren't going to care if you know anything about this snake.
They will just sell it to you, make a quick dollar, and that's all they care about. Not everyone, not all vendors, but some sellers are just in it for the money, unfortunately. So it's up to you to do the research so that the animal isn't the one that ends up suffering.
This also goes with the theme. He needs a name.
Oh, yes, he does. This little boy is one of our babies.
Yep.
Another holdback of ours.
Yeah.
Now, that all being said, a lot of folks will say that there are certain species of reptiles that make good beginner reptile species. And examples would be like corn snakes and bearded dragons and leopard geckos. Ball pythons, crested geckos, yeah. But don't think you have to limit yourself to those like roughly 5-ish species that are considered beginner reptiles. For example, hognose snakes, we usually recommend as a second reptile. However, if you do a lot of research, then maybe you could consider a hognose snake for your first reptile. We really just recommend hognose snakes as a second reptile because they're pretty hands-off initially, and you definitely want to hold your first reptile right away, right? And hognoses just don't handle that very well. But again, if you do your research, there's no reason why a hognose snake couldn't be your first reptile. They say in the bird world, get the bird species that you want for your first bird, because if you start with a cockatiel, or in the reptile equivalent, if you start with a corn snake because you're told you have to start with a corn snake, then that corn snake years down the road when you have your dream reptile, that corn's gonna end up in a rescue. You're not gonna care about that corn snake as much. So make sure you get an animal that you are going to love long term. And sometimes that means going out of the norm for your beginner species.
There are some caveats to this one though.
Oh, definitely.
Like venomous animals.
Okay.
Probably don't want to do that. Retics, maybe get something before
Okay.
like 20-foot retic.
Anaconda.
Anacondas,
Okay,
you know.
that's a good point. There are some exceptions that you just don't want to get.
And I have seen people get those as first pets and do perfect with them.
That's true.
But
yeah. Anyway, try to be responsible is what Ed is saying.
Exactly.
And do your research. But that concludes our top 5 most common mistakes that new reptile keepers make. This, by the way, is a red albino. Is he a conda too?
Yes.
He does look conda, yeah. A red albino conda hognose snake. And she looks like a girl, actually. Yeah, she is a little girl. This one just came out of quarantine, so she doesn't have a name yet either. So let us know what we should name this little girl. And I hope that you enjoyed today's video, and hopefully it comes in handy if you are considering getting your first reptile or just got your first reptile.
This would be a good video to watch if you're trying to convince your parents to get you a reptile and you watched that video already.
That video just came out. You can tie these together for your presentation that we talked about in that video, which I guess I'll link to the description below now. If we missed any mistakes for the experienced keepers watching, if we missed any, let us know in the comments below, because there were more mistakes that we thought of to include in this video, but we wanted to limit ourselves to 5. So if you would like us to do another 5 common mistakes video, let us know and we will be happy to do so. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you Patreon backers for your amazing support as always, and help us name all these reptiles.
Shameless plug too, if you want the Snake Discovery t-shirt, you can go to snakediscoverystore.com.